Good morning, brothers and sisters. A few sentences from our Book of Common Prayer as we begin morning prayer. When the wicked man turneth away from his wickedness, that he hath committed, and doeth that which is lawful and right, he shall save his soul alive. Ezekiel 18:27. As we approach church history here today, we want to keep that in mind, that original sin is evident in the history of the church and is rather small press accountability, but it is an assumption, a belief, a faith that we have from our being trained in the Old and New Testaments. So let us begin. We start our work with William Laud. Bishop Fitzsimons Allison has given us in chapter 1, classical Anglican divines as he views it. And then he's got this other chapter with these other characters, and he's not telling us the whole story, so we have to kind of backtrack and catch up and review things. We're turning now to my favorite archbishop, Archbishop William Laud, styled the most reverend and right honorable. He was born in 1573, October, and he dies 10 January 1645. He was a Church of England clergyman and Archbishop of Canterbury, as appointed by Charles I in 1633. He was a key advocate of Charles's religious reforms. We're not sure what that means. He was arrested by the Parliament 7 years later in 1640 and executed toward the end of the First English Civil War in January 1645. He was a firm believer in the divine rights of episcopacy, or the rule of bishops. Laudianism was a subject that was neglected, no chapter at all, in the Oxford History of Anglicanism, Volume 1, 1520 to 1622, which we get references here and there, but no extended treatment of Laudianism. And Professor Milton Anthony draws attention to his own omission, or their own omission, whoever put together that volume. But Laudianism refers to liturgical practices, which is hard really to understand. They had the Book of Common Prayer that governed everything, but I guess he put some doodads and extras in there, like putting a rail around the altar table. So apparently in some churches, with doors open, dogs and cats might run it. Seriously. And he advocated for keeping the churches clean and beautiful, but that's hardly Laudian. Designed to enforce uniformity in the Church of England as outlined by Charles. There were some who were taking liberties and free-winging it and substituting parts of the prayer book. Now, how far and extensive that was, don't know. But the bugbear and bête noire is often the Puritans. Often highly ritualistic, these were what would become known as the precursors to the High Church views. In theology, Laud was accused of Arminianism, while covertly favoring Roman doctrines, it said, and opposed Calvinism. Now, we've seen that. That's just a fact. Anything out of Geneva was on his radar screen as something nasty. And we would suggest here that little Laud came nowhere near to some of the great divines on the continent, like Calvin and Theodore Beza. Not even, I don't think, any comparison to Matthew Parker or John Whitgift. He was regarded by the Puritan clerics as a formidable and dangerous man, because of his high position. He began stuffing bishoprics with his colleague Arminians. Question they asked, where are the Arminians in England? Well, they're in all the high positions, thanks to Laud. He used the Star Chamber to persecute his opponents like William Prynne, which made him further unpopular. Word gets out fast, when you've got a persecutor. Opposing opponents I think he cut Prynne's ears off or split his nose or did something. Laud favored scholars, it said, was a major collector of manuscripts and pursued ecumenical contacts with the Greek Orthodox Church. The famous pun was, give great praise to the Lord and little laud to the devil. He's also known to be rather touchy about his short stature. He was ordained in 1601 at age 28. He's consecrated by George Montaigne in 1621 at 48. He was born in Reading, Berkshire, outside London, 7 October 1573. The only son of William Laud, a clothier, and he was a little sensitive on that too, because he was not an aristocrat. He was from the artisan class. And Lucy, widow of John Robinson, another clothier in town. He was educated at Reading School and went to St. John's in 1589. At Oxford, he was taught by Dr. Thomas Holland, matriculating in 17 October. In 1593, he became a fellow of the college, but he has some run-ins here and there, we're told. He graduated with a BA in 1594. That would have made him, 20 years old? 21 years old. An MA in 1598, and a DD in 1608. We have questions about that, as we did with Cranmer. What was required for the Doctor of Divinity? While Laud was going through his exercises as a candidate for the degree of Bachelor of Divinity in 1604, he contended that there could be no true churches without diocesan episcopacy. 1604, what is he? 31-year-old, asserting his prejudices, which unchurched the Swiss, the French, the Hungarians, although they had bishops, and other reformed communities. Willy-nilly Laud. For this, the young aspirant was sharply rebuked by Dr. Holland, who presided at the occasion. How do you think Willie took that? He's a bitter type of a man and an angry type of man underneath it all. He was severely reprimanded that the future primate of all England, he was called one who sought to sow discord among brethren and between the churches of England and the Reformed churches abroad. Do you think that's going to let up when the Synod of Dort meets? Or when the Irish Articles of 1615 are promulgated? As an undergraduate, Laud had as his tutor John Buckridge, who became the president of St. John's in 1605. Laud was ordained a deacon 1601 at the age of 28, 5 April in the same year, age 28, as a presbyter. It says priest here, but presbyter. 1603, he was one of the proctors for the year. Under James I, he left Buckridge for St. John's in 1611, and Laud succeeded Buckridge as president, but only after a hard patronage struggle reaching high court circles. The rival candidate, John Rawlinson, was chaplain to Lord Ellesmere, who was both Chancellor of the University and Lord Chancellor of England. Laud was a chaplain to Richard Neil, who was the Clerk of the Closet. And I think Neil was an Arminian too. Eventually, King James brushed aside the irregularities, settling the matter in Laud's favor. Laud became the Dean of Gloucester in 1616. 39-year-old bishop, Gloucester, Hooper's Episcopal see, and a glorious church. Famous episcopate. He knew of Hooper's death. And it raises the question: what does Laud think of the reformers? What does he think of the Calvinistic consensus in England? What does he view about Calvinistic conformists? What does he think about Calvinistic, somewhat quasi-nonconformists, although that was illegal to be nonconformist? At Gloucester Cathedral, he began ceremonial innovations with the communion table, which would have been putting it up against the east wall. Did he talk about having the back to the people? This is serious. By local custom, the table stood in the middle of the choir. And that's out quite a ways from the eastern wall and in the choir, where the choir people sing. That was the custom also in parish churches, rather than at the east end, as was typical of cathedrals. Laud believed that he had the king's blessing to renovate and improve the rundown building, but he offended. Now, he's the dean at Gloucester, but he offended his bishop, Miles Smith. He's going to cause a lot of offenses everywhere he goes, by the way. Neil was Laud's consistent patron. Neil sought but could not obtain Laud's appointment as Dean of Westminster, a post that John Williams retained. So we see some politicking here, as we would expect in a hierarchical church at the state church high aristocratic level. But at the end of 1621, and despite the king's view of Laud as a troublemaker, where did that come from? What did King James know, and when did he know it? What did he see, and when did he see it? What did he hear, and from whom did he hear? Pending questions, but King James knew Willie Laud was trouble and restless. He was going to create trouble wherever he went, as memory serves. Nevertheless, Laud received the relatively low see as the Bishop of St. David's out in Wales, way out west, and in the boondocks. I mean, the boondocks, a little tiny town there. I mean, tiny is like not even an accurate description. We're talking about one street light type small. You're in and out of it in 1 to 2 minutes. And I'm not even sure he visited his diocese. I'm not sure of that. It's kind of like it was given to him, and that's that. I remember talking to the archivist at St. David's. She was not thrilled to have Lottie Boy's picture on the wall. Laud became a confidant of George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, at the end of the reign. The Buckingham household employed John Percy, a Jesuit, as a chaplain. Uh-oh. English recusant with a Jesuit chaplain, and the king wished to counter well-founded rumors that Percy was making converts there. What do you think the Jesuits doing? Well-founded rumors, too. And what's old Willie Laud doing up in there? What's he learning, and what's he seeing, and what is he desiring? In a 3-day series of private debates with Percy in 1622, the Jesuit Laud was introduced to argue the Protestant case on the final day. Pamphlets resulted. He then displaced John Preston as the religious advisor to the Duke, a change that became clear around December 1624. How did Laud argue the Protestant cause? Inquiring minds would like to know. Historians believe that Laud, who never married, had homosexual leanings. That's kind of my view, which he nevertheless seems to have managed discreetly. His private diary does contain evidence of erotic dreams he had about Buckingham and other men. I need to reread that. It was a supreme exhibit of narcissism. And we might ask the question, did he write any books on the Old Testament? Did he write any books on the New Testament? Did he write any devotional literature? We've got sermons, but the sermons are all about the absolute royalty, absolute royalism of the monarch. 1625 to 28, Laud ascended rapidly to a position of influence in the court between 1626 and 28, advancing not alone but with a group of like-minded clerics who obtained bishoprics. What does Laud think of the Synod of Dort? What does Charles I think of Synod of Dort? We know James I allegedly concurred with the findings. But where's Charlie? And where's Willie? In 1626, he was translated from St. David's at low-profile episcopal see to the Bishop of Bath and Wells. It's a bigger, larger place, huge, actually. And in September that year, he took the court position of Dean of the Chapel Royal, that would be in London, vacated by the death of Laud Andrews. What does Will Laud know of Lance Andrews and his theology? Lanny was an Arminian. And when I say Arminian, they were under the radar screen. They're being careful. They're up against a Calvinistic consensus. And it's kind of funny to read the Oxford History of Anglicanism and see them call these guys avant-garde conformists. There's serpentine paths of Arminianism. And we want to rethink the Arminian stuff all over again. I've been through that years and years and years back, and we're reformed here. I can hardly bring myself to do all that. But what are the practical consequences of Arminianism over here? What about contemporary theology where we live in 2020? Well, a few days later, Buckingham told him outright that he was to succeed as Archbishop of Canterbury when George Abbot died. And George Abbot does not, in my estimation, get treated very fairly in the history of Anglicanism. He just never appears in the books. Archbishop of Canterbury. He immediately changed the chapel services to privileged prayer over preaching, since King Charles's views were the opposite of his father's. James I liked preaching, but it was a prayer book service. Come on. What does that mean? He privileged prayer over preaching. Well, he becomes the Bishop of London. In 1628, he's transferred from Bath and Wells to the Bishop of London, and moves that followed on from the death of Lanny Andrews, the Arminian. After this breakthrough in church politics, it became meaningful to define Laudians or Lauders as his followers. On the political stage, the personal rule of Charles I began in 1629, and Laud shortly became a key part of it, with allegiance to Thomas Wentworth. Historian Mark Perry argues that by 1626, in private consultations with the king and Buckingham and his public role in the House of Lords, Laud was a highly effective parliamentarian and key advisor and policymaker. So he's a shrewd and a crafty fellow living in London, even though he's the bishop of out west. And you can expect this kind of guy to be hanging around like a parasite on the court. Laud distrusted parliamentary bargaining and was always determined to resist all encroachments on the royal prerogative, especially in matters of taxation. Again, what kind of theological work is he doing? What's he reading? What's he thinking? What does he believe? His strong positions were the focus of attack during his trial in 1644. Well, you pull the sword, you may die by the sword, said Jesus. When Wentworth was posted to Ireland in 1632, Laud brought his personal correspondence from him rapidly to the king's attention. It is this correspondence in 1633 that the word thorough appears. In practical terms, it meant that the pursuit of ambitious political objectives, policy objectives on behalf of the king, disregarding special interests and particularly legalistic prevarications. There were opponents at court. Richard Weston, 1st Earl of Portland, Francis Cottingham, 1st Baron Cottington, and Queen Henrietta Maria, the papist Spanish wife of Charles I. Cottington observed that Laud could not keep his temper in council meetings. Why are we not surprised there? The little clothier with a pompous high view of himself, really high. And by 1637, Laud found that he could not follow Wentworth in imagining their believing that his push for rigid policies would not succeed. Now we think of Laud as an archbishop. He's almost 60 years old when he became archbishop. He'd waited for a decade to replace George Abbot, who was no longer prepared to compromise any aspect of his policy. Abbott's chaplains had licensed Histomastics for publication in 1630. The book, which attacked English theater and Christmas celebrations, among others, had caused a scandal when it appeared in 1632. Now, remember, Shakespeare has died in 1616, and the Globe Theater goes on, is very popular. One of Laud's early moves was to bring in his own men as censors. Samuel Baker, chaplain to William Juxon, William Bray, and Matthew Weeks. The operation of the censors, including William Haywood, who joined them, became a focus of the Long Parliament as soon as it was convened in November 1640. And Laud ultimately had to answer for Haywood at his own trial. Whereas Wentworth, who became the Earl of Stratford in 1640, saw the political dangers of Puritanism, Laud saw the Calvinistic movement's threat to episcopacy. Not all, by the way. But the Puritans themselves felt threatened. The Counter-Reformation succeeding abroad, and the Protestants were not winning the 30 Years' War. In this climate, Laud's high church policy was seen as sinister, controlling, governing, arrogant. A year after Laud's appointment as the Archbishop of Canterbury, the ship Griffin left for America, carrying religious dissidents such as Anne Hutchinson, the Reverend John Lothrop, and the Reverend Zacharias Symes. Laud's desire to impose uniformity on the Church of England was driven by a belief that it was his office's duty. But his methods seemed persecution to those of differing views. Thus, they had unintended consequence of garnering support for the most implacable opponents of Anglican compromise. In 1636, Histomastics' author, an X and an S there, William Prynne, sponsored by George Abbot, the Archbishop, was convicted of seditious libel, along with John Bastwick and Henry Burton, and had their ears cropped and their faces branded. Prynne, parliamentarian and Puritan, reinterpreted the SL, seditious library, branded on his forehead as stigmata laudis. Laud also moved to silence his critics among the bishops, including John Williams, who was convicted of various offenses in the Star Chamber. Would you like to go to William Laud's Star Chamber? Contrary to Laud's expectation, Williams refused to resign as the Bishop of Lincoln, and the Lords forced his release, after which Williams supported the impeachment of both Stratford and Laud. So it's not just Puritans, but you've got an Anglican bishop opposing Laud. Williams specifically urged the king not to commute Stafford's death sentence, and he was executed in 1641, months before Charles I promoted Williams to the Archbishopric of York, only to be re-imprisoned by Parliament and then join the king in Yorkshire upon his release. Toward the end of his life, Charles I admitted that he put too much trust in Laud and allowed his peevish humors and obsession with points of ritual to inflame divisions within the church. He warned his son not to rely on anyone else's judgment in such matters. Laud, on his side, could not forgive the king for allowing Stafford's execution and dismissed his royal master as a mild and gracious prince that knows not how to be made or be made great. Well, he's tried. The Long Parliament of 1640 accused Laud of treason, and in the Grand Remonstrance of 1641 called for his imprisonment. Laud was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he remained throughout the early stages of the English Civil War. Apart from a few personal enemies like William Prynne and maybe Archbishop Williams of York, Parliament showed little anxiety to proceed against Laud. Given his age of 68 in 1641, most members would have preferred to just leave him to die of natural causes. That might have been a better way. In the spring of 1644, he was brought to trial, which, however, ended without a verdict. As with Stafford, it proved impossible to point to a specific action which could be seen as treasonable. Parliament took up the issue and eventually passed a bill of attainder under which he was beheaded, aged 71, 10 January 1645 on Tower Hill, notwithstanding being granted a royal pardon. Laud was buried in the chapel of St. John's College, Oxford, his alma mater. Laud is remembered by Anglicans on 10 January. His collected works in 7 volumes was published between 1847 and 1860 in the Anglo-Catholic Theology, Library of the Anglo-Catholic Theology. We need to go back and, if we dare to, maybe just in a survey fashion as to what he covered. I can hardly bring myself to read 7 volumes of Willie Laud. And I'll bet 10 to 1 he's not working in systematics, Old or New Testament. Probably a lot of sermons. and probably a lot of narcissism, like his diary, definitely. Emeritus Professor at Cambridge, Patrick Collinson, an expert in English Puritanism and the English Reformation, who has noted that the English church was Calvinistic and had a consensus on that, in 1980 published this rebuke. Laud, in his book, Over the Decades Until 1625, was the great, and since then was the greatest calamity ever visited upon the English church. It's quite a judgment by that historian. Well, we have to bring that to an end, and tomorrow we will pick up with Bishop Fitzsimons Allison's discussion on William Laud and his view of justification by faith alone. And it's ever so brief. He gave like 20 pages to William Forbes, the Scottish bishop, and now we got a page on Laud. What's going on here? Anyways, let's pause for prayer. Lord, we offer our thinking and deliberations to you, and in your almighty and omnipotent presence, pray that you would sanctify our deliberations, that it might conduce to your glory, to our edification and strengthening in these times of 2020. This we ask in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Till next time, Godspeed.